And now, live from Studio One in Castlebar, it's the Jack McDonald Show.
Hello, you are listening to the Jack McDonald Show. Fantastic to be back. We're back in a new location. You know the way they say everybody nowadays is starting a podcast? It looks like, based on kind of the background here, that somebody has started a podcast from Mountjoy. That is not the case. I'm here in my college accommodation. We have obviously a new location, but we also have new equipment, which I'm more excited about, to be honest with you, than the location. It's fantastic to be back. As always, thanks so much for the reception from the last one, which was Alan Clark, the most successful interview the Jack McDonald Show has ever done, which is fantastic. Alan, really well received. He's a hard man to pin down in a lot of aspects because he's very wide ranging, but I'd say somebody who's a local man made good, and really thoroughly enjoyed that chat. So if you didn't catch it, go back, have a listen. Otherwise, stay tuned, please subscribe, hit all the relevant bells and likes and whistles, leave a review, all of those things, because we have a big episode today. We have a man called Manchán Magan. This interview, I'm not messing with you, is my favorite of all time. And I don't say that lightly. We have talked to some great people over the last couple of years on this program, but Manchán is so incredible. He encapsulates a world that really, I think, a movie would not be far away from. 2 or 3 hours would not encapsulate this man's life, but it certainly might do it a bit of justice. He has traveled the world, he has interacted with so many different cultures, and ultimately he has decided to put all that knowledge and skill into the Irish language. And so we talk about the Irish language, we talk about his travels, we talk about the fact briefly that he doesn't have a TV, and he's such an interesting character that only comes up, I think, tangentially, the fact that he doesn't have a TV and kind of lives in the wilderness in Meath. That's how interesting the guy is. So that's coming up, but also the news with Muiris. There's a lot going on as January kind of fades away into the distance now. We're starting to get into the real stuff. People are getting into scandals. Big deals are being promised by government. And even a sheriff's office in Florida are making some pretty interesting moves in the world. So all of those things, I think, are phenomenal and worth tuning into. But without further ado, the one, the only, Manchán Magan.
It's a pleasure to have you on the programme. Firstly, I suppose I want to start from the outside, kind of looking in, because if you told myself and indeed my poor mother that 6 months ago, as I was doing the Leaving Cert, that I would be sitting in front of you talking about the Irish language in anything other than a very fraught tone, I think we both would have had a heart attack. But to be honest with you, because of this book, which is 32 words for field, which I have here in front of me, it has really kind of impassioned a bit of national spirit in me, and you are the man to thank for it. So I suppose we'll start on that tone, Manchán. You are really managing to, I suppose, light a fire in the Irish language at the moment.
Yeah, and it's a total mystery to me about how this is happening. Like, it's clearly, something beyond me. There clearly seems to be an energy at the moment that people were either looking for meaning or were looking for some profundity or something stable in a world where everything is changing so much, and they seem to be finding it in the Irish language. And as you said, just my book happened to come out at a peak point during the COVID outbreak in September of 2020, and it caught people's attention. As part of this whole rising up of people wanting certainty and realizing that they might find it in this rooted connection and culture we have that is sort of arises out of our time on this land for thousands of years.
Yes, and the book itself is kind of in fitting with your character. For anybody that is familiar maybe with your podcast interviews, you've done quite a few over the last, say, year or two with people like the Two Johnnies or Blind Boy, or just generally your work with T.G. Cahir or the Irish Times over the last, say, 30 years. You have kind of made a living out of being a professional eccentric. And I don't say that in a pejorative way, rather in quite of a celebratory way, in that when society seems to zig, you zag. Tell me a little bit about that.
I mean, I'm just being myself. And I suppose I was born in 1970 into a world where myself wasn't quite the norm. The interest I had, this connection with other plants and with nature, and this real love I had with the Irish language, which I got from my grandmother. They weren't normal things. And so normally that would be the recipe for kind of a loner oddball. But somehow I decided my secret was by traveling. I just went away when I was 19 and went and realized that there were people like me all over the world, sort of backpackers, I suppose, and people in other cultures. So I spent so much of my time either in India, in Africa, South America, with other eccentrics or oddballs who didn't fit in. And then I came back to Ireland and I found this little niche. It was just so lucky. The TGR were just being set up. So they allowed me, because I was interested in travel and had Irish language, to make my little programs. And then the Irish Times, from whenever, like I suppose, whenever I started writing with them, allowed this, as you say, this slightly eccentric marginal voice. And who would have thought, though, that sort of eccentric marginal voice, that a person, has my 10 acres in Westmeath and built my little house and have my hens and sometimes my pigs and my bees, that would have struck a chord in people. But it has. So this is like my moment in the sunshine, and no doubt I'll go back under my cave or into my hole very soon again.
Well, I think that would not be for the better of society. When we have seen you over the last year or two, I think it has maybe made people question, how they live. And certainly the perspective you gained 30 or 40 years ago when you went traveling, I think is an interesting place maybe to focus the conversation. You have spent a lot of your life as a travel writer, and part of that was traveling first and writing second. Tell me a little bit about running a farm in South America with a load of workers, or getting stranded in Africa with a bag of weed and no passport.
Yeah, well, again, so it was in this whole journey of me running away. I didn't make sense of the world, and you can get through school fine like that. You just, have your own little magical world. I suppose people now, people are playing Dungeons and Dragons. I didn't have that. Wasn't around when I was young. But then at the age of 19, people said, okay, now you have to wise up. Now you have to go to college and get a career and settle down. And I knew I couldn't do that, so I basically fled. At the time, this was the late 80s. I was able to earn money in Germany, so I had a bit of money, and I fled. I went off first Africa, and I realized you could cross Africa on the back of a truck in these ex-army trucks. So the first moment I arrived in Morocco and spent the next 7 months, going through Algeria, through the Sahara, through Niger and Burkina Faso and Togo and Benin, and into Central African Republic and Cameroon, I was open to an entire different world, a world where so much of this people being grounded in the landscape and in their old traditions was still a key idea. And that made sense to me. And people who still believed in the other world and believed in other ancestral spirits being present at all times, somehow that chimed with me. So that was like 7 months just in the back of a truck. But I kept on wanting to go places. So as you said, I ended up running a farm, an organic farm on the Ecuador-Peruvian border, only because I got rabies. I got rabies in Ecuador, and the only reason I got rabies was because I had heard that there was a commune up in the mountains in Colombia, a commune run by the Atlantis Group, or the Screamers. This were this Irish cult who used to live on an island off the Donegal coast, and they fled. They left Ireland because, well, they were chased away by medical services.
They were chased away by medical services, as in like the HSE.
Yeah, well, the equivalent of it in the 80s. It was found out that they were over-sexualizing their children. They believed in free love, which was a fine thing, and they really believed in trying to overcome the terrible, shame and body guilt that we had in Ireland. But then they also believed in allowing children find their sexuality at a young enough age. And so this obviously was frowned upon by the health services.
A step too far.
Yeah, they had to get out of Ireland. So I ended up living with them up in the Andes, in the Himalayas, in the Andes in Colombia. And I went a bit too far. They got under my skin because they believed in primal screaming, basically insulting you and screaming and trying to get you in touch with your own anger and fury so that you would free yourself from the oppression that all of us in Ireland had. And I just got too sucked into it, and eventually I had to flee, and I fled to Ecuador, and I ended up just trying to get my head together, getting on a bicycle, going down.
Before we go to Ecuador for a second, Manchán, this group, what did you find in them? Was it maybe a paternal figure, or was it kind of a fraternal? Was it a group of people? Was there something obviously must have drawn you to them if they were able to kind of pierce under your skin so effectively?
Yeah. And so they were a matriarchal tribe, which was so interested me. And in fact, it's what I've been following ever since. So I would have spent a lot of time in China, in Yunnan province, up with the matriarchal tribes there, the Nasi and the Masu people. And I suppose my latest book, Listen to the Land Speaks, by mistake, has turned out to be a study of the goddess and the female energy in the Irish landscape and in Irish culture and the Irish language. So I hadn't noticed that trend before until you asked the question, but it was fascinating. The Screamers, or Atlantis as they like to be called, were run by Jenny James, a very powerful, strong English woman who had originally been part of the squat movement in London in the 70s, and her sister Snowy James. And anyway, there were other women, very powerful women there when I was there. So I loved how connected they were with nature, and how they were trying to go back and find connections with the old Irish culture and the Scottish culture with the indigenous cultures in South America. So there was a lot, and they were also doing amazing work of teaching the local people, the campesino, the peasant farmers, not to cut down trees and to grow vegetables in an organic way instead. So there was a lot of really idealistic things they were doing. But
you felt that at a certain point it was time to break free, perhaps.
Yeah, their normal modus operandi is to break the human being, and then so that the person who visits them, to turn them against their parents, so then that they started ringing up their parents demanding money. That was their mode that they were going on for a few decades. They are now no more. I mean, I know some of them. I know them now. I'm friendly with them. They've more or less tried to get back into society.
And how is that? Sorry, we've gone down a little bit of a tangent, but that is fascinating to be kind of so remote and so within an ideology, but to have to shave the beard and the long hair and don I suppose, a corporate attire. Have some of them been able to do that?
Yeah, a lot of them would have. There was never very many of them, and in fact, I write a little bit about them in a book called "Angels and Rabies," about my time in South America. It's a book actually I haven't talked about on the Blind Boy podcast yet. At some point, I will, and at some point, people will find out about that book. But for the moment, these were books that came out 15 years ago. People wouldn't know about them. You can get them in libraries, and you can get Angels and Rabies still too in shops. But yeah, so it was always a small group, maybe like maximum 24 people, often only 12 people. And they did heroic things. Like at one time, they had this commune building in Burtonport in Donegal, and they had an island in Ishfree off the coast of Donegal. And at one point, a young IRA recruit fled in the late 70s from Belfast or from Derry. He fled thinking, God, actually, what am I doing getting caught up in all this violence? I would much prefer to just make free love and smoke cannabis. Or did they take drugs? Yeah, they did, but they weren't actually in favor of drugs. They were in favor of freeing your mind through sex primarily. Anyway, this young Republican IRA man came, and when the IRA leadership realized this, they were furious, and so they sent down a delegation to the Screamers and said, give us back our young Ogla, our young, warrior. And Jenny James came out and said, no. She says, come in here with your bombs if you want. He's safe. And she stood up to them in the late 70s. She was heroic.
When it took a lot to stand up to the IRA, of course.
Yeah, and there was a lot of titillation. So there were a lot of articles in the newspapers and sort of the Irish press about them in the 80s. But yeah, since then, the whole thing has sort of fallen apart. A few of them are still in South America, but they're no longer part of this commune or group or cult. And some would realize that, that they were brainwashed, and they have tried to remend connections with their parents, which was hard because a lot of them would rang up the parents and say, you abuse me, you sexually abuse me, I want money. And that would have been because the Screamers had convinced these people that they were sexually abused. They were highly manipulative. They were incredibly successful at getting under people's skin and basically breaking you. And all of us in Ireland needed to be broken back then. We were all so repressed and so tied up in, as the Screamers said to me when they did their best over nights to shake, to break me, they'd say, look at you, you're tied up in the priest's aprons, the black priest's clothing and your mother's aprons strings. You're not half a man. You're just a weak fucking faggot. You are useless. Try and get in connection with your own anger, your own body, your own physicality. And they were right about a lot of those things, but unfortunately, while they began with the very best of intentions, it ended up just very angry and very messed up. And
that disagreeableness, though, in yourself, Manchán, is very interesting, isn't it? Because you needed, I think, to be a writer and to do all of the facets that you have been so successful at. But if you didn't have that element of disagreeableness, it's very possible that you would still be off on an island off the coast of almost nowhere, making the odd satellite phone call, demanding money off people who don't want to talk to you anymore.
Oh, I mean, you're so right. I spent so much time among marginal people and alternative communities, as I said, in Colombia, in Canada, in India, in Africa. And I saw so many people who went too far down that path. And like when I was up in India for another year in the Himalayas, I was looking for a cave to try and meditate for months. I didn't find one, but I found a cowshed instead and moved in there for months and went deep into parts of my own brain that other people would call insanity. But I always had the ability to sort of pull myself back from too far into beyond the beyond. But I saw so many other people lose themselves either in drugs or in their own mind or in some cultish behavior, or even in spirituality. You can. So luckily, as you said, I had that tendency to explore those things, but also either maybe I'm very conservative or safe. I do always pull myself back to the groundedness, to the rootedness of the Irish language and Irish culture and the land in Ireland itself.
And I suppose if we talk about your roots for a second, they are very against the idea of finding a cowshed and meditating there for months. They are much more traditional. You have a very traditional background, I suppose a more Republican background. Your grandmother was Sheila Humphreys. You are a descendant of the O'Rahilly. So these are very kind of in-rooted people in the Irish Republican movement. In one of your appearances on the Blind Boy podcast, you spoke about waking up one morning and there being Republicans just kind of stashed in your granny's flat. So all of that is so much against the idea of meditating in a cowshed.
It is and it isn't. So you see, my granny, when she was born, and my great granduncle, the O'Rahilly, didn't have Irish when they were born. They were products of the early 20th century where they reinvented themselves. They decided, who are we? We don't know who we are. At the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of Europe was thinking about this. Let's recreate our own nationality. Let's find our independence from Britain and then recreate our myth. So they went back, like Yeats, who was a friend of the O'Rahillys, and others would have gone back and my relations, the T.F. O'Rahilly and Cecil O'Rahilly, went back to the old manuscripts, found our own mythology again. Then the O'Rahilly brought my grandmother to the Blasket Islands and learned Irish again on the Blasket Islands and almost recreated. And the O'Rahilly sister, who was a key fighter, just as passionate as her brother, the O'Rahilly, she was also interested in Madame Blavatsky and vegetarianism in the 1910s. So really, they were just a blank palimpsest, an open book looking for meaning in the world, just like what's happening in this new generation of young people now who are experiencing a world where nothing makes sense anymore. All the old groundedness and the hierarchies of the church, of money, of religion, they're all gone, and we're wondering, and of a stable climate are all gone. And just like they were 100 years ago, we are looking for who we are, and we're going back into our past. That'll be interesting.
Just as that cult didn't manage to, I suppose, suck you in entirely, nor did the more extreme ideas of republicanism, especially towards, say, the 70s and the 80s, they didn't manage to get under your skin either. Not necessarily that your own descendants would have been to that level of it, but certainly it's not like you were a million miles away from it. You could see how a descendant of that kind of, I suppose, that foray of Republican thought could move a little bit more towards the right and become, for example, a militant Republican. You didn't go down that side of it either.
No, but like I would have been helping my grandmother in the 1980s when she was writing to H block prisoners and to IRA men. So I was very close to it, as you say, and my grandmother would have been bringing me on IRA protest or Sinn Féin protest in the 80s. But I always, as you said, I have this moderate streak. So in the same way as people of my persuasion then would have gone very deep into New Age and into sort of doing rituals on the top of mountains in Ireland, which is part of this whole bardic or druidic resurgence that's happening now. And I don't tend to do that either. I believe that there's wisdom in the way of the Screamers in Atlantis. There's a way of wisdom in the O'Reilly and my granny, and even what the IRA were doing, trying to find independence for Ireland. But I'm not a extremist in any way. So in the same way, I like the Irish language, but I love German, I love French, I love Spanish too. It's not just about Ireland, Irish culture and Irish language. It's just about, this is just another example of old cultures. And Irish culture fascinates me no more or no less than the matriarchal cultures of Yunnan or the Tarahumara cultures of Mexico or the Bedouin cultures. They're all just examples of human beings in different minority groups in extreme places, surviving by living in a harmonious and sustainable way with the landscape.
Well, it's funny, once I suppose your traveling subsided a small bit, you decided to find yourself in an extreme place, but not in South America or Africa, but in Meath, in your own self-built house. And you did not only one of these, but two. Can you explain to the listeners the process of building your own house?
Yeah, so that was in 1997. So the TGR set up in 1996, and my brother and I made our first TV series on India in 1996. And I came home there, and my granny, Sheila Humphreys, had just died, and she left me 10 grand. So I was able to buy land. I wanted 10 acres, and I ended up in Westmeath only because every other county sort of laughed me out of it when I tried to go down to Wexford or Wicklow or Kerry. But the land agents in Westmeath said, "Don't worry, we're going to take that 10 grand from you." And I bought 10 acres. And I knew all the places I'd been. When I'd been in Bolivia, people were making their houses out of reeds, and in Nepal, they were making them out of stone, and in Africa, made out of wood. So I thought, that's what I'll do. Rather than getting a mortgage and enslaving myself to a system, I would just build my own house out of whatever material was nearby. And so I ended up using bales of straw. I got 200 bales of straw from a neighbor, just because oaten straw, because that was what was being grown around here. And I built this house. I sort of contacted Westmeath County Council and told them I was going to build an unusual house, and maybe the best idea is if they came out and had a look at it. And if they liked it, then I'd build a proper one with planning permission. And they were very kind. They allowed me, or they just told me not to bother them and leave them alone. But they let me live in that house for 5 years, to build it and live in it. And then I got permission for a proper straw bale house, and I knocked the first little one, and I built the second one in 2002, and I'm still here today. Although I didn't use bales of straw on the walls in the end. I chickened out for the second house, and it was a mix of mud and straw and stone and rock and cement block, and then grass on the roof of this second house.
Are you happy with the house 20 years on? What do you make of it?
I am. I mean, I've just got a heat pump put in and just had new triple glazing about 3 months ago. But it's a small house. It's a tiny one-room house with a bathroom. And I just like small houses. I presume my name Manchán or Monaghan means little monk, and I presume I probably had other incarnations as a monk. I love living in simple houses.
Well, I suppose when we go to simplicity, the idea of the most simple language should be the Irish language. But increasingly, it is becoming less and less spoken, less and less talked about, and ultimately, it is a language very much on the decline. You have begun to write more and more about the Irish language, and I suppose bring it to the fore quite a bit. Your own work and even your podcast appearances, I think, have sparked a little bit of a conversation about where the Irish language sits in Ireland in the 21st century. Can you explain to me a little bit about your process towards coming to the Irish language? Because you mentioned at certain points you weren't necessarily the most interested in the Irish language, but then it gripped you.
Yeah, exactly. So although Irish was the first language I spoke, but then realizing how for my grandmother it was connected up with Republican consciousness, I did move away from it a bit. And so what reconnected me was all those years. I think I spent about a decade making TGR programs about minority cultures all over the world. So in Greenland, in India, in Africa, throughout South America, and realizing wherever I went, I'd find these minority cultures who had these ancient languages that allowed them to live in an entirely rooted and sustainable way in their landscape. Because within these languages was all the amassed knowledge of their people. And it was actually on Lanyu Island off the coast of Taiwan that it suddenly dawned on me, we have the exact same thing in Ireland. We have this profound legacy of a language. A lot of us have this Bronze Age DNA within us, which means we've been on this island for 4,500 years, doing the exact same thing, growing a bit of grain, looking after cattle, and living in harmony with the landscape. In a very remote and wild and rocky and inhospitable place, we have thrived, except during the extremes of British colonialism when their policies caused famine. But we thrived. And within that, a key element of where we kept the knowledge of how we did that and how our ancestors lived for thousands of years was within the Irish language and the folklore and literature that goes with the Irish language. And so the Irish language we've been speaking here for at least 2,500 years, but possibly it has echoes of the language that was spoken before it. And certainly our mythology seems to have stories that go back not only to us, the Bronze Age people, but back to the Neolithic people, the Stone Age people who came before us, and even possibly back to the first hunter-gatherers who arrived here 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. So it's an incredible legacy. It's a legacy that's more akin to what you might find among Aboriginal people or Indigenous people today. And so I thought, this is too rich a source of wisdom, of nourishment, of insight for us just to dismiss as a language that we say is tricky because of the Mo Keneala case or because of it's complicated because it's how it's taught in school. This might be our most precious jewel. And within it has the wisdom and the knowledge of how to live in an entirely healthy and sustainable way. So I thought it's vital we go back to the language. And I thought, how would I go about presenting the language within that perspective, within a sense that it is just another of these ancient languages that keeps within it all the knowledge that has been gathered over time, and get over the small-mindedness of these arguments about that the government mess it up or the schools make it useless or that it's useless in the modern world. So I decided to write a book, and it took a long time. It took about 6 to 7 years to write this book, 32 Words for Field. And I had no idea that it would get under people's skin in the way that it has. And so it's so beautiful. There's so many people, young people now, doing new and clever things within the Irish language. And I believe it has the seeds of a revolution. People are deeply unhappy with the status quo at the moment. And there's a way potentially that we can reimagine ourselves and our relationship with time, with the mythic, with the past, with our ancestors through this language.
Because it's one of the things I wondered when speaking to you, ahead of speaking to you, I wondered, did you see yourself as an archivist in that you were writing about a language that you had accepted was in the swan song, that it was kind of on the way out? Or were you an advocate that you wanted to see the re-emergence of the Irish language? I think based on that monologue, you would say that you are a pretty strong advocate for the resurgence of the Irish language.
I am. I'm a realist too. I realise when I go to the Gaeltacht and they see absolute wealth of Irish that's in the Gaeltacht. Like, I have a project, I collect sea words. I go to fishermen. I was just before Christmas, I was down in West Kerry talking to fishermen and finding more words from that area about the coastal life, about the maritime conditions, about the weather. It is incredibly rich. Each single, rock, each headland has so many words and stories and anecdotes and insights connected to it. All of that has been lost. And there's no way that people in the city, by taking back Irish, can relearn all that. So I am so aware of the vast amount of information that is being lost. But I am also aware that none of us are happy anymore. We feel this sort of flus, this vacuum inside of ourselves, and we want to find meaning in the world. And I do believe that the Irish language might be a key to doing that. And I don't even believe that it means you need to get fluent in it. We teach an online Irish language course called Scoil Scarta that I'm involved with. And it's not only the language, but the whole mindset. And people who learn even a few words find weird things happening inside their brain. They find thinking in different ways. They find connections with their bodies. That makes no rational sense, and I don't fully understand it. But in the last year and a half, I've been talking to more and more Indigenous people, and they tell me that there's something a lot more potent and profound within the words and energies of a language than the language itself. So I don't think maybe it's not necessary for us to become fluent in the language. Just by turning back to it, I believe that there might be, I don't know, processes or energies or catalysts that can open. Again, I really am I'm not certain about any of this. It's just something that I'm seeing in front of me every day.
As I was preparing for this and thinking about the Irish language and maybe why people around me don't speak it, and I suppose the process of change Ireland has gone through in the last, say, 40 or 50 years, we mentioned, of course, the church and how, especially maybe your generation, Manchán, started to really rebel against the church, and then my generation and other generations picked that baton up, and now very much the church is an absolute shell of what it was. There is, or for many people, I think from the outside in, would see that there is this connection between the Irish language and the church. And maybe it's because of the ill-fated nature of the church in Ireland at the moment that Irish maybe was lost along with the church. Was there always a connection between religion and the Irish language? Because to me, there's something that always seemed innate about Irish and religion.
Mm-hmm. Irish is a deeply pagan language, and the Gaeltacht are deeply pagan places, and they are places where, Irish rural people in the Gaeltacht have less respect for priests, or had less respect for priests than anywhere else. And also the Gaeltacht is a place that is deeply comfortable with the sexual and the body and the physicality of the body. So I think in 32 Words for Fields, I had a chapter about all the different words for a penis and for different forms of sexuality and joy to be had.
I haven't got to that chapter yet, Manchán.
It's a deeply physical. There's no sense of shame. It has that same relationship with the body and sex that you might find in an African culture or in another native cultures or a tribal South American culture. There's, love, sex is a form of expression of joy, of creation. It's something to be celebrated. So that is a key element of the Irish language. Also in the Irish language is these so many pagan ideas. Like when I was down in Micheál recently, I was telling people that long ago, the word deisill used to be used when you coughed. When you coughed, you say sunwise. And they told me in Micheál, we still say that. So they said, if someone sneezes, you say Díal Linn, God be with us. If someone coughs, you say deisill, sunwise, which is invoking the sun god, basically. It is pure paganism. So within terms of education, church-controlled education, and because us in non-Gaeltacht areas, we think of the Irish language as an element of education, and so it's connected with the church. It is a piety connected to it. But so most of our perspective from, if we're not in a Gaeltacht, we think the Irish language is connected with politics, with either Sinn Féin or meanderings or the goings-on in government, or otherwise the church, or otherwise schools. But actually in its context, in its living context, in the Gaeltacht of Donegal, of Connemara, of Cork and Kerry and Waterford, it is a earthy, dynamic, wild, pagan language that is really inviting. It's exactly what young people want, actually. It is a rootedness, a connection, an absence of bullshit, an absence of systems of order, of government of the man. It's revolutionary and radical and marginal. But as I say, unfortunately, this area where the language is so strong, the Gaeltachts are a place that are dying,
Well, it's very interesting, and I'm certainly not finished the book. I've only got it a couple of days, and I haven't got to the chapter about 32 Words for Penis. But what I have got to is a very interesting passage where you compare your experiences in Kerry, in the Gaeltacht in Kerry versus Connemara, and you note how the different interactions play out and how they decide to, I suppose, greet you, and they seem to ask, is it yourself? To which you respond, it is myself. And that's in Kerry, whereas in Connemara, they ask, who are you a descendant of? And I thought those little differences were very, very interesting. Is there any more that you found in your travels?
Great person to talk about that is Donal O'Haley, who was in the movie Arach, the movie that was Oscar nominated. His father is from Kerry and his mother is from Connemara. And there's just two very different worlds. Connemara, you see, Kerry had better land, in Munster. It also had the Norman influence. So the reason that in Kerry Irish, we say aran, like a shaw pale, was we put the aran we put the stress on the second syllable because of the Norman influence, because of the French influence. So the French language had such an influence. So we had the backing, we had the wealth of the Fitzgeralds, of the big Norman families. Whereas Connemara, it was wild, Counter na Nilán, out that rocky area, out past Carna, Lettermallen, Lettermullen. It is wild, poaching, smuggling, rocky island place. And so there wasn't that same, you had to be tougher. You were going to cart the nart na nur, as O'Diron says. You were eking out the rights from the essence of the rock or of the elements. And so it was by nature, Connemara people are more fighters, they're more tough, they're more resilient, whereas Kerry had it a little bit easier. And then Donegal is different again, of course, because they were so much looking at Scotland. They were so often going to Scotland to get money for potato picking, and then coming back, or to build the roads and then coming back to live. So each Gaeltacht is remarkably different. And as you say, that beautiful expression that I used to hear in West Kerry, Nachto, and then the expression Isme. And Nachto, isn't it yourself? And Isme, it's me. But then as a kid, I remember the Browndown Begley, the musician, the father of Cormac Begley, the other great squeeze box player, him and his sister said to me, when they'd be seeing the farmers going across to the creamery on their horse and cart, they'd say Nachto, and you'd say Nime, it isn't me. And you had to run away then, because the farmer had a whip always for the cow or for the horse, and he might whip you if you said the wrong thing. But they're simple things, but they're so rooted in who we were that our identity was based on our very essence. It wasn't based on, on Facebook likes or on what Joe Duffy was saying on RTE. It was a far more core and elemental.
Well, Manchán Magan, it is yourself, and it has been a pleasure. If people want to check out your work, as I say, I'm thoroughly enjoying your book, 32 Words for Field. It's available in all good bookshops around the place. You can listen to your series you do with RTE. That's available as a podcast. And there are so many other offerings, for example, Blind Boy or even The Two Johnnies. You are very omnipresent for a man that doesn't have a television. Thanks so much, Manchán.
Thanks so much, Jack. Good to talk.
Genuinely, thanks so much, Manchán, for taking the time. I really, really enjoyed that. As I say, in terms of the news, it has been jam-packed for the last couple of weeks, which is just why I drafted in this man, Muiris of the College View.
Well, in the week that was, there has been a huge amount of different stories circulating around, and certainly a few to delve our teeth into. And to do so, I'm joined by the deputy editor of the College View, Muiris. How are things, Muiris?
Oh, very good.
Good.
Yeah, I'm
well,
great.
I
Thanks
suppose,
for having me.
No problem. There's so many stories to get to, and there's a good few that I'm really interested in. The first one that I kind of want to touch into is this Florida man story. It's much lighter, but it's equally as funny. We'll play the clip now.
This Florida Sheriff's Office is being sued over a mock game they call Wheel of Fugitive.
Welcome to Wheel of Fugitive. You know how it works. All 10 people up here have warrants for their arrest. We want to get them off the streets and safely behind bars where they can't victimize anybody else. Let's see who our fugitive of the week is.
Once the spinning ends, the presenter reveals the full name and birth date of the fugitive selected, as well as the reason for their warrant and their last known location. These videos are published weekly and garner thousands of views. Now, the sheriff's office is being sued by David Gay, who says he was already in jail when he appeared in an episode and therefore was not a fugitive. In the lawsuit, Gay claims it ruined his reputation, created anxiety and depression, and caused him to lose a job because a potential employer allegedly saw the video. In 2021, Florida Today analyzed the videos and found that nearly 33% of people featured in the videos were not fugitives and in most cases were already in jail. Despite those findings and the new lawsuit, the Brevard County Sheriff's Office continues to post weekly episodes.
What do you make of that, Muiris?
It's the weirdest Florida man case I've seen because he actually has a point. Like, it's just libel. Like, it's just not fair whatsoever. But also, it's just a wild thing for them to do. Like,
it's hilarious that they have assigned a budget. Yeah. This sheriff's office have assigned a video production budget. And, like, if you watch the video, it's so well produced.
Exactly, that's what I was about to say. It's like it's not as if they just set up a camcorder and they purposely bought and set up that wheel they have the lights on the green screen.
It's like
in the
winning
background.
streak.
Literally.
But your prize is a one-way ticket to the clink, you know? So, yeah, apparently David Gay has sued the agency and Sheriff Wayne Ivey for 50 grand, accusing them of defamation and emotional distress after his picture and identity were included in 4 videos.
They did not let this man alone. Like,
no.
They just...
And there's a stat as well, which is, I think it's 33% of the people who are included are not fugitives.
Yeah.
But by the same token, the show must go on, you know?
That's a very fair point, and I'm sure that's what the sheriff's
and
office
hopefully
said
the
as well.
judge concludes the same thing. I would love, to be honest with you, if the guards did this. Do you remember during COVID, we had the incident where they told us, you know, to all go in our houses and they would basically lock you up if you hugged a loved one. But then they made the video of them dancing around the place to like foster support, and it was the most ridiculous thing. And I think it was pretty poorly received for due course. I would love to see them maybe take more of this kind of approach. You know what I mean?
Just really take the piss out of us further. Like, no, I feel like in this case it's funny because like it's just a funny scenario, but it isn't fair on your man because he had started a new job and the case was dropped. Like, all charges were dropped, and then I think it said he was, after the second time he was featured in the clip, his boss seen the clip and all he said was, "Don't bother coming into work tomorrow." And he was like, "Okay,
Are you your man from the sheriff's
like,
Facebook
screenshot
post?"
this you."
Well, hopefully neither of us end up in a video like that. But I would like to see the cops bring that into Ireland. And if they want to do it, we are available for hire in any and all respect.
I mean, I'll feature on the wheel if needs be.
Anyway, moving on. Somebody who may feature on the wheel very soon is Tánaiste Micheál Martin, because he has decided to get himself a lovely brand spanking new jet. And in my opinion, if the green people who are out there who love the planet and they're very into the planet, if they create a wheel, he's definitely going on it. Because in a time of telling us to reduce our emissions, to live in a cardboard box and, you know, never even fart, let alone drive a car, he's decided to buy a brand spanking new or a second-hand jet.
I know. I think, actually, to be fair, they didn't use the first jet, much at all. So, and it's really only used to go back and forth from Brussels. So it's not as if, but see, the thing is, the jet that they have at the moment, that's like going out of commission, can't do cross-Atlantic flights. Like they just would take commercial flights. And every other country has this, you know, has their nice fleet of government planes, whereas we have like basically Aaron Air bringing up, shuttling us from, you know, Tory down to Holyhead or Howth, or whatever, you know, probably Howth more than likely. So, like there's a definite, like you say, the Greens putting them on that wheel, definitely. But you have to see, like,
I see both sides of it, and I get you on that one, because, like, you know, from a political perspective, everybody is showing up in a Bentley and we're showing up in a Corolla.
Yes,
you know?
Literally.
So there is that aspect to it. We are power brokers. We have to show up in some amount of fashion. You know, it's all right for the Americans to still think we're leprechauns, but we do need the multinational companies and some of the power brokers in Europe to respect us as an entity.
And I think that's like, you know, look how big our cocks are. Like, that's kind of the only way they're going about this. But
by the same token,
they're saying it's second hand.
By the same token, I don't take a jet when I go to Brussels.
Yes.
I take a Ryanair flight. You know what I mean? Yeah. All I want in life is a nice little house, a nice car, you know, just a few nice, simple pleasures. So, you know, if any of us are to agree to kind of take away what many would see as their right to have an open fire or have a you know, diesel car. So if you're to surrender those rights, it's very difficult to surrender them to people who are publicly going, yeah, I need a new jet, mate.
And see, that's the thing as well. Stephen Donnelly, actually, I think it was that he missed his flight, or he chose not to get a commercial flight, so he would instead take the jet. And that was like what started this story about, wait, we have a jet? I didn't know we had that, and how often is it used? And one of the DCU alumni, Gabi Gadavictani, I'm really sorry.
You got that well, yeah.
Yeah. But she's a political correspondent. She looked into in the Independent, and she looked into like how often they're using the jet, and it actually wasn't that much. But at the same time, they were like, "Oh yeah, no, we're really sorry that Stio used the jet the other day when he was meant to go on a Ryanair flight, but we actually need a new one now that you're talking about it. So could you give us that money, please?"
Now that the jet is in conversation, we need another one. Yeah. So I suppose moving on, one of the stories I heard yourself talking about on the College View podcast, and I thought was very interesting, is this idea of the rise of the far right, contrasted against the background of protests against asylum seekers, against refugees, especially Ukrainian refugees that you see in places like Ballymun. I was talking on DCU-FM earlier about how on yesterday evening I was coming back from work, and there was just both sides of the road, while waiting for the bus, both sides of the road were kind of blocked off. But it wasn't enthusiastic enough for me to believe it was a protest. I just thought people were hanging around. And then I looked and like some of them were holding signs, but it was a very sorry excuse for a protest, to be honest with you. Like, they wouldn't really enthuse you to join their group. It was it was a sad affair. And that has always been my opinion of this so-called far right. The government and many journalists are painting it a different way. I wondered what you thought of the whole thing.
Yeah, I just think Irish people don't really have an appetite for that type of politics, and it's not really reflected at all in our Dáil, in our elections. There's two parties that are mainly like running this sort of fiasco of sorry little protests, and it's not, no one cares. People are actually quite laughing at them, and those two parties, they're not in government, they're not even on like local committees or local councils. There's no appetite for it in Ireland.
But there is an appetite for the protests, because I think, when you see a lot of those protests, they're so buoyed on, and they do feel very organic, you know what I mean? And I even contrast it to some of the ones we've seen during COVID, which at times were organic, and you could see there was a big, swell of people going, seriously, I can't take this anymore. And then there were others where it was like 4 people. I remember in Cork, 4 people who all seemed to share the same set of teeth. They were just not really respectable people. And so, yeah, I think we can generally distinguish an organic from an inorganic protest, and some of the protests in places like Ballymun do seem to be organic.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was talking on the College View podcast about, is that these communities, that community especially, has been sort of neglected by the government for years on end. So to be I use the term on the podcast, micro-radicalized, and that's kind of what these groups are doing to these communities. So for them to come in and say the government is doing you wrong in this sense, they're not giving you or your sister or your brother or your family member a house who's on the housing list for 10 plus years, but instead they're giving them to people like the refugees, which totally is not true. But that they're just going to have no other belief but to believe someone telling them that the government's doing them wrong, because there's that long running trend of the government doing exactly that. But one of the points is like where you and I would look at maybe the failings of the immigration system in Ireland, the failings of direct provision, where you and I would blame the government. These people are blaming the refugees themselves, and that's totally not fair at all. There's a very good and interesting and fair conversation and questions to be asked around, like today there was a letter put out by Roderick O'Gorman, who's the Minister for Integration, and he said that we need school halls, we need derelict buildings, we need additional homes that people can house these people in. At that rate, we will get 2,000 places for these people to come in, and we're expecting 90,000.
Yeah.
So you and I can look at this and go, what are they doing? Them being the government, whereas the rest of the crowd go, well, they shouldn't be coming in at all. And them, in that sense, is the people who are fleeing war and poverty and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, there's a very interesting conversation to be had because there is a real risk, when you look at, so the government solution at times may be school halls or things like that, but it's currently modular housing. Modular housing is going in across the country to house people. But generally our housing policy, and this is very in the weeds conversation, but it's worth having, our housing policy has generally been that if a housing estate is being built by a housing developer, say 24 houses, 2 or 3 of those houses will go to the government, who in turn house people who can't afford a place. And the idea being that because people are able to afford a 300 grand house, that they're of some stable will, that they're probably middle class, a firefighter and a nurse. So if you put somebody who's maybe a little bit down on their luck beside a community like that they will in turn build themselves up. And it has been relatively successful, especially when you consider things like the Ballymun flats, which are the other side of it, which is a different policy, which didn't really work because you're putting lots of disenfranchised people in, together, and humans, no matter what socioeconomic background you are vicious creatures. So they attack each other. And especially when nobody has any, money to negotiate with or jobs to go to, they attack each other in such vile circumstances.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people out there do have concerns about things like modular housing and, putting loads of Ukrainian people together and not, putting a couple in your estate, and, more kind of integrating the people better. And even in my own community in Castlebar, there's often comments that you just don't see the Ukrainian people. They're in a place called Brafey Sports Hall. They're housed, I think about 1,000 of them are out there right now. But you just don't see them in the community. And that is alarming because you want people to integrate properly within a community such that racist dogma can't be sprouted because they are the people who pour your pint or who work with you at the supermarket or whatever. You know them personally. Yeah. Whereas at the moment, I think a lot of people don't know them personally because of things like housing policy. And if we continue down this modular housing and putting all of one people together, I would definitely have concerns about that.
Yeah, and modular housing is never going to be the long-term outlook to fix this cause. Like, no one can live in a prefab, essentially, for the rest of their life. But there's also, on the other side, yes, there's issues with the housing policy, and the reason that we have these modular homes and quick builds is because we don't have enough of the social homes to even house people who need them, who are born here. And that's kind of the sense, though even those types of comments pass off as if, they should be taking care of Irish people first. But it's actually, if we had an abundance of social housing, there'd be no housing market. If we had too little, like we have right now, there's no houses for anyone, regardless of where you're from or what your socioeconomic background is. I think, you made the point there, with Ballymun and the flats, that was a very good point that you made. But they've redeveloped the entire area and they've built the area into somewhere where it's actually quite pleasant to live. It's quite pleasant to see that community working together. And that took a long time. And I would hate to see sort of modular housing estates become something of the basic cesspit that we saw Ballymun turn into in the 70s, 80s and 90s.
Yes. And as they say, the most permanent thing is an impermanent solution.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's the danger. We've all been in schools where the prefab was supposed to be there for 2 years and it's been there for 22 years, So hopefully all of those things resolve themselves and hopefully we don't end up on the front of the Journal or some far-right website. Either side, we're not interested in being painted as. But speaking of being painted, a public art mural bill is to be introduced in the Dáil. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I think it's actually pretty cool. I followed the story, I think it was 2020, late 2019, early 2020, it was Subset. They were painting murals all around the city.
And just explain for people out there, and even myself, who the hell Subset are?
They're just like an art kind of community art collective, and they decided to commission paintings by Dublin artists to show like a new outlook of Irish life. And sort of modernise the artwork that we've seen, like the Hags with the Bags or Molly Malone. That sort of legacy artwork that we see on Dublin Street.
Bring it into the 21st century.
Yeah, bring it in 21st century, draw these beautiful modern murals on walls. But the thing was, these walls were publicly owned, not owned by the person, and not owned by the person who painted on them, and they didn't get permission first, so they would be taken down. Where the community around these murals were like, they are amazing, wow. So in Phibsborough, there's a good few there, and actually they've been there quite a while because they had to go and they went through the proper processes. But that's not what Subset were about. Subset were about, one night, day turns the night, and the next morning there's this beautiful piece of art on your road.
Yeah.
And it creates Dublin.
Paperwork isn't exactly sexy or radical.
Exactly. So this bill will allow them to do that in a certain way that makes it easier to where it's a little bit more sexy. There will be paperwork, there will be things you have to process.
Yeah, because none of us want to wake up in the morning and there's like a Bobby Sands mural on the side of our house. It could go wrong.
Yes.
And I'd like to at least make sure that the people whose properties are being painted on have some degree of input in the whole thing.
And the majority of the murals that were painted, it wasn't like, they're just painting on the side of someone's house or in their back garden. They were being painted on walls that were like council owned or walls.
Jerry, they're after painting on our house again.
Yeah, so they were doing that, but the council were like, no, we don't want that on our thing either. That's the other side of it too.
And I wonder as well, because say a Bobby Sands mural, that's one thing that's kind of a political, but what if you wake up and the side of your house has been painted and it's just something really shit? Like, it's not political. It's just like, I don't really want that on the side. I wonder, is there provisions for that? Can people come together and go, you can paint, on the local church or whatever, but just don't make it shite.
Yeah. And there will probably be status checks and things like that, and like standards that you
Quality
need to make.
check.
Yeah. Standards that you need to make. Maybe submit a portfolio before you.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just imagining someone waking up and it's just like SpongeBob and Patrick with the Irish flag in the background.
Two 70-year-olds and they got SpongeBob on the side of their house. Well, I suppose on the topic of support, Micheál Martin has indicated support for decriminalising drugs in Ireland.
It's interesting.
This is one that we were going back and forth on before we came on air, and I think it's very fascinating. Ireland is a place that so many people see as backwards and kind of, a bunch of bog dwellers who do nothing but go to mass on a Sunday and eat spuds. But if this is to come to pass, it's a hell of a progress, even from 6 months ago where, for example, we had the electric picnic fiasco where they promised that people would be able to go and test their drugs like you're able to do in every other European modern city. And the guard said, oh, no, if you're caught with a bag of cocaine, you'll be going to jail. Don't be at that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it was shut down within 6 hours or something. So what do you make of this whole thing?
I think it's actually quite interesting. They're talking about a slow pathway from decriminalisation to legal. So no one, in Thailand, they made, what's his name? Ironically, the TD who's the chair of the Justice Committee is named James Lawless. Anyway, so he's the one kind of spearheading this, and he made the point where
I was just thinking there, you go in Thailand and then you said TD, and I was thinking, do they have loads of TDs in Thailand?
Well, I mean,
Vote Fine Gael.
I'm not too sure where James Lawless went on holidays to find out this, but Thailand basically, they woke up one day and all drugs were legal, and going from you were arrested for a gram of weed to just do what you want, and I mean that turned out as as you probably
as
would
you'd
think.
expect.
And he said he said on drive time this evening, instead of parties on the streets, it was more vomit on the streets. So they don't want to have a situation like that. They would much rather have something like you see in the Netherlands, in Canada, in the States, where they slowly decriminalise most drugs and then legislate them. I think it's actually quite an interesting idea. He was talking about how you're going out for a pint, which is a drug. Alcohol is a drug. But you're going out for a pint with your friend, and instead of popping into the shop for a cigarette, you pop in the shop for a joint. And the difference that the stigma around that has to change through decriminalisation before.
He's
before
planning a hell of a night.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't know if you should be mixing a Guinness and a Rolly, but I get your point, which is obviously everything is a drug, and I think it's very fair to say, indeed, Fianna Fáil TDs James Gullis and Paul McAuliffe have shown their support by saying the war on drugs is not working, and I think that's a very fair statement.
Yeah.
The guards spend so much time chasing people for a couple of bags of cocaine or something like that. And it's basically impossible to fight against now, even in rural communities where the idea of cocaine, sure, that would never be around. Unfortunately, it's everywhere now, and you talk to even nightclub bouncers or cops, and that's what they say is it's everywhere. You really can't police against it because when there is enough will to do something, humans will conquer it. And it's good.
Earlier, vicious animals, especially on coke.
It's certainly we're not painting humans as the best people, but you would become a bit of a vicious animal on coke, I imagine. So Leo Varadkar and Micheál Martin have promised a citizens' assembly. People in the Oireachtas Committee have recommended the decriminalisation for personal use in December, and many people are calling for that citizens' assembly to be held as soon as possible, and for the drug testing pilot scheme, which semi-occurred at Electric Picnic, to be properly rolled out at all festivals.
The Electric Picnic one was interesting because I think a lot of people just thought they would get away with a lot more. And I think the guards come out and be like, hold on, lads, no, you can't be smoking that doobie around me. Like, instead of saying that, they were kind of like, yeah, you're fine, but like personal quantities, I think like
show up with a big brick.
Yeah, exactly. Like fucking Jack is just there rubbing his hands. Like,
is this good? Because all my customers have been asking for it.
Yeah. So they didn't want to encourage any dealing, but they did say personal use only. I didn't have any drugs. That started that sentence. Hold on. I had friends who got stopped by Gardaí, and they literally all they did was just like, okay, give me it. Okay, see you later. And then that was it. But the ones who were able to get stuff through, when they did go to the testing centres, there was no one there to sort of like,
with the handcuffs.
Yeah. There was no one ring fencing them into another tent that looked very similar. Where there's a chain on a little like stick. You pull it up and you're going to cage.
Just while you wait for your results, there, just step into this room here.
The light comes out.
I think it could be very good, and certainly the reality is that drugs, if they are everywhere, then it's often helpful to think about your own family members and things like that, and you don't know who in your own family could be involved in drugs or whatever, but it could be the case that a cousin or a brother or sister go to a thing like Electric Picnic, they make one bad choice, they decide to do some coke or some other drug, and because there isn't facilities like testing properly in place, some very bad outcome could happen, simply because we want to keep this closed-minded view that sure, it's not happening and sure, no one's on drugs.
And see, the other aspect of it too is like they're not going to just anyone can walk in and be like, can I sell this to you, and you can sell it again. They're going to have like warnings and exact like percentages and the potency of everything, so that people firstly know what they're getting. They can ask for a certain
it's amount. Like an NCT for your cocaine.
literally but like in the stores they're like talking about the off license for drugs. There's going to be checks and balances in place to make sure that no 10-year-old is walking in getting 16 grams of very potent cocaine. But your point there about someone making a mistake or choosing to do something as they have the right to, and then for like regretting it either fatally or whatever other sense, that's something that is a very good point, because that's what the testing centres are exactly for. It's to stop this sort of thing. I went to Forbidden Fruit this week, not this week, this summer, and during the festival they had these big projectors kind of everywhere, and there was just sort of like stage left this way, stage B this way, all that type of stuff. But one of the stuff that kept coming up on the screen was a photo of an MDMA pill. Actually, this was at Electric Picnic. It was a photo of MDMA pill. It also happened at Forbidden Fruit. And it was like, this is 5 times the usual dose of MDMA. If you get this pill, do not take it, or take it at your own risk. And it's because no one went in to test it. Someone had gone in going, I took this and I can't feel my hands, or I'm about to eat my toes off or something. They tested it and it was like, oh God. And,
Yeah.
you know, he was probably in the tent for the rest of the weekend, shaking back and forth.
Having a great time.
But that's the other aspect of it as well. If you don't necessarily bring drugs into a festival, but you do purchase them there, there's going to be posters and flyers everywhere letting you know of the ones not to buy, to stay away from, or to be cautious of.
Yeah, and I think as well we must be careful because, you know, it's very easy to go on a landslide victory. You know what I mean? To go, previously we had no opinion that was positive of drugs. Now do everything. Heroin is great. It's all great. Yeah. There are definitely levels to it, and I would prefer, if it was a brother or sister of mine, I would prefer them to be having a pint of Coke, a pint of maybe a pint of Coca-Cola, but a pint of Guinness, as opposed to a bag of cocaine. That's a clear, or a bag of heroin or whatever. You know, there are levels to this, but certainly if you are going to engage in those activities, it's good that we're not adding unnecessary strain to paramedics, to cops, and we're also protecting your own life, even if at that moment you're not too concerned about protecting it because of some of the ways you go about it. Well, that is very interesting. A man who has come back into the spotlight, and I'm not sure if any of it is positive, but he has come back into the spotlight in slightly a more positive tone, is Mr. Mason Greenwood, as all charges of attempted rape have been dropped. Now, this is a massive story. The 21-year-old was arrested in January 2022 amid allegations surrounding images and videos. I'm sure everybody out there saw those videos circulating. They were really, really concerning, and certainly something that you would just never like to experience yourself, or even, I think, if you knew the man, you certainly would be deleting his contact number because they were just so incendiary. Now, obviously, the charges have been dropped. What do you think this means for the story overall?
I mean, we spoke again about this before we came on. It's a question now, is this probably one of the biggest, defamation cases that we will see ever? Or is it a case that it was just, they just decided, never mind, I don't want to go through this anymore? It's an interesting thing because the cases, the charges have been dropped, but Man United still haven't accepted him back with open arms. They still have not put him in training. They still haven't fired him, but they still haven't put him back in training, and they won't put him in matches before an internal investigation begins.
And they've only included him on a couple of team sheets.
Yes.
And the speculation has long surrounding been that it's more contract and legal issues.
Yes.
That because of an ongoing court case, they can't necessarily be seen to drop somebody entirely, but they can do everything in their power to limit his exposure to the squad.
And I mean, it's a case of public opinion versus the court of public opinion compared to the court of law. You said lots of people saw and heard and viewed those images and videos and the voice recordings. When I heard that, I thought it was a pretty open and short case from the very beginning. But then there was odd aspects of the woman's father coming out saying that she will regret this decision, attributing it to the amount of fame, wealth that this man has. And he said that he's still part of the family,
which is just a crazy thing to say. With everything swirling on, it's not necessarily casting a light of guilt on Mason Greenwood, but certainly when those things are levelled at you by somebody, and for that person's daughter to go, or that person's father to go, you're still part of the family, you're still one of us, is it just absolutely bizarre. It's also worth noting, we got in the weeds on housing policy, in the weeds on policy over here when it comes to things of sexual assault nature. Currently, the Irish policy is that essentially that is not allowed to be reported. So if the Mason Greenwood case was in Ireland, you would not be allowed to report that until a guilty verdict was found. And for me, I can see the sense in it, not necessarily with the Mason Greenwood case, but there has been some high-profile cases that have been leaked in Ireland, for example, where it looked very open and shut, and I had an opinion of the person. And then when the full case was settled, the light turned out to be very different. So there is, as we say, there is a defamation element to some of these cases, not necessarily casting this case in one light or the other, but it is interesting to note that is our policy in Ireland, is to not name anybody involved until the verdict is reached.
Yeah, and I think, though, with social media, especially with the level of fame that he had, like, he was probably one of the best players on Man United squad at the time. With the level of fame that he had, the level of like virality that these videos and recordings went, if that case was in Ireland, there was no way that no one would know that he's on trial.
And for good and for bad, because so you could argue that at the start of this case, when everything emerged, it was said by a lot of people that this was, good, because basically it would help other women come out, that this woman had stood up to a very high-profile man, and this would give other people courage. So that element was said. Now, by the same token, for these things to be dropped, and they have said there is a withdrawal of a key witness, whoever that witness is. For it to turn out the way it has, this could, in theory, disincentivize people who are being abused in relationships to come out. Yeah. And that's the unfortunate reality. The virtues of the Irish system mean that when this case started, it wouldn't have been a rallying cry necessarily for people to speak out, which is unfortunate. But if this case had ended the way it has now, or maybe in the Irish system we would have kept the key witnesses because they wouldn't have felt intimidated by online pressure. There is an argument to keeping things a little bit more subtle and a little bit more quiet, and letting the high-paid lawyers and the professional policemen and policewomen, to let them do their thing without a media circus going on, because it can definitely impede on the case. Yeah,
definitely, and I think that's exactly what happened here. That witness pulling out, regardless of who it was, it's like that person will eventually be named of who it was, or someone is going to find out if not. And that's like a really big stretch. And your point, this kind of deters people from sharing their own stories and taking their own stories to court. This has happened time and time and time again with these types of cases, and that's why they are so difficult, both for in a societal way, but also in like a legal way. It's difficult to prove. It's very taboo still to talk about and to report on. But I think the way you say, like Ireland, the way Ireland does it, it protects the victims, it protects the witnesses, and it also protects the person, because regardless of how that story pans out, if it's guilty or legal, that person will have their name cleared, or didn't even have to have their name cleared because it was never soiled to begin with. But it's a very interesting way to look at it, because as well, he's so young, and whether people kind of agree with this or not, he is a good player. He has had a career.
He has a talent, and it could happen regardless of whether it's a footballer, but just kind of taking it at a broader case. When somebody definitely can be deterred and from seeking employment opportunities. People's lives can be really affected by a negative, accusation as well, a false accusation. As as people with true accusations, of course, their lives have been significantly.
I think, like, to go back to my point, the court of public opinion, like the recordings and the images that were shared, tell the story already to what people kind of need to know about this topic, especially if that the brave woman, had the courage to stand up to him. I don't see that.
There wasn't really much
that he had.
There wasn't. What was odd about those recordings was there was no moment where you could have said it was out of context or something like that. It seems so cut and dry, as you say. It wasn't inferring something or something in the background. It was smack bang in the face that this was something really vile happening to another person. So. Yeah, I suppose that's kind of all we can say on that one, because it is so complicated with so many different angles to it. On a slightly less serious note, Seth Rogen isn't convinced anyone has made a good movie, has made a good high school movie since Superbad. What do you make of this?
I think he's wrong. I love 21 Jump Street. If that's what he means, like kind of comedy, high school comedy stuff. I love 21 Jump Street. I love Step Brothers. Is that what he means?
I don't know.
Is
Is he drawn the scope so specific to high school movies? Because like, how many of those are made at any point in time?
Exactly.
There's Dazed and Confused, which is that Matthew McConaughey. All right.
Yeah.
There's Fast Times at Ridgemount High, and maybe 2 or 3 others, but. Yeah, that's like saying I've just made the best DCU Larkfield movie ever.
It's very specific, very one-sided. And as I said, it's just a wide open topic. I would view this as the movies I would watch while I was in school, like the same type of humor.
I do miss those movies, though. That they were kind of light subject matter, low stakes, but a bit of fun for 2 hours.
Leave your brain at the door sort of vibe and just like laugh. You know?
Kind of $40 million to make, $100 million gross.
No one's really taking away though from the I don't know what gave him the urge to say no one has made a good movie. No one was talking bad on Superbad at all.
I wonder is this a question of maybe himself getting a little bit in his head? Seth Rogen has become an interesting character, very kind of public on things like Twitter. I remember Casey Neistat, the vlogger, criticized LA, and Seth Rogen went back and forth with him for hours about LA, despite the fact that he's from Canada. And it was just a very odd thing to pick a gripe with. And he's done that a few times where, I don't know, sometimes people who seem like the most happy, cheery people can actually have a little bit of an egotistical side and maybe a darker side.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just a weird. I think you're right. It's ego fuel. You know, getting the headline. No one has made a good movie, so then someone can tweet at him and be like, "You're full of shit," and he'd be like, "No, you're full of shit," and have the same idea again.
Now, he could have been just done bad by the press in that maybe it was an offhanded comment and they've turned it into an article. Who knows? But something that it certainly is circulating around the press, and again, I'm not sure how I feel about this. We should all know it. Campaign for everybody in Ireland to learn Aran Naveen. What do you make of this?
I went to a Gael school, so that song was beaten into
You survived a Gael school.
But, I went to primary and secondary Gael schools, and that song was part of the syllabus. You know, every year, whether it's SPHE or your history class, everyone's going to stand up and recite it. Or in primary school, it was from junior infants all the way to 6th class, you would have 40 minutes a day. Every day.
Of Aran Naveen. I wouldn't put it past it for a Gael school. They are dangerous places to spend too much time in.
Yeah, I know. You're very easily radicalized, let me tell you. I also think, everyone kind of knows the words, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, you can hum along to that middle part, but...
at the very end, everyone just goes, "Go on, Douglas!
Go on, Mayo!"
Yeah, no one actually says the last part, Erenos, if you want to go that way.
I don't know. I see the point in it, which is essentially that Ireland has changed as a society, which is, I think, kind of the theme of some of the articles we've been going through. Ireland has changed as a society. Even I've brought it up before, the Irish national team. When you look at it, it's a completely diverse mix of people, but no one would contest their Irishness. They are people who consider themselves Irish, and we see them as Irish, you know. But they're certainly not the old school, which was everybody went to St. Kevin's, maybe one from Wicklow. It was a hugely Dublin-centric team. Packy Bonner, maybe from Donegal. There was the odd country lad, but it was white, Catholic. 11 men on the field representing the Pope in some odd way. Now it has changed to being a whole mix of people whose mother maybe was from Ghana or Sri Lanka or all different places. Yeah. And so because
ironically, they're some of our best players.
Exactly, and because of that, it's no fault of their own that maybe they're not familiar with Aran Naveen or just people in general who are first generation Irish or second or whatever. So I can kind of understand the impetus behind it, but by the same token, it does seem a bit oddly nationalistic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you're dead right.
Who has come up with this campaign?
Let's have a look. Let's see exactly.
It's Rachel J. Cooper, author of Our National Anthem, which is a children's book, and she's heading up the initiative. So obviously she's quite proud of the Irish anthem, and I think it obviously ties in quite well with her children's book. And she feels that there's not enough focus and attention on it. And certainly, it is the centenary of Gaeilge being published, and there's a lot of kind of national pride floating around at the moment. So I can kind of understand.
Well, there is national pride.
Yes.
On what spectrum do you want to go? But yeah, I mean, the other part of it as well is like there's lads who like didn't grow up here and who don't speak Irish fluently or at all.
Well, I certainly don't speak Irish fluently.
But like you would probably be able to string a sentence together if you really
had to.
Like gun to your head sort of vibe. But like when you trying to learn the national anthem, there's some very difficult words that I don't even know the meaning of in there. And I'm like I'm saying them, I'm like, yeah, okay, but I'm not getting the pronunciation right. It's very old Irish that they're using. And to expect, someone with Ghanaian mam or who was born and bred in, Lancaster, to be expected to learn this Irish song off by heart, it's difficult,
It's difficult, but by the same token, in the era of Drake and Miley Cyrus and all those people, I think, to be honest with you, if I'm stopped at traffic lights and I look over to the left, I'd like to see somebody in a Toyota or a Kia just singing along to the national anthem rather than always being like these pop songs that are just about sex or, money and drive and hustle. Maybe it's time to just make the Irish language a bit more sexy.
It's never going to be sexy, I'm sorry. Is it that language will never be sexy? But I actually will launch an opposite campaign.
Competing campaign.
A competing campaign and make it so that we have a Drake song as the national anthem instead.
No, you hand in your Irish card the minute you do that. That is just not acceptable at all. And then you'll have a load of annoying Canadians coming over going, I hear you've got Drake as your national anthem. Yeah, and it would just turn into a charade. But I suppose, to be honest with you, buying a new government jet, many people would see as a charade. Yeah. And indeed, putting loads of fugitives on a wheel and spinning them could be seen as a charade. So a fantastic recap of the news. Thanks so much, Marsh.
Of course.
Well, that's our lot, folks. Thanks so much for taking the time. It has been phenomenal, as always, to share the space with you. Launching Mountjoy's first ever podcast from inside the prison. Thanks, as always, for liking, for viewing, for subscribing, all of those things. We're a podcast. You can find it wherever good podcast programs are available, and even some of those bad ones. Stay tuned, and we'll see you next week.